Let me tell you, I'm not talking about a little cold snap where you wear an extra sweater and complain about the heating bill. I'm talking about the kind of cold that makes the air feel like glass in your lungs, the kind that cracks the big ponderosa pines right down the middle with a sound like a rifle shot. That was the winter of '98, up near the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana, and that winter, it wasn't just cold, it was personal. It was trying to kill me. My name is Jed Stone. I built my cabin 20 years ago, dug the well myself, and learned how to live off the land like my grandpa taught me. I'm not some tourist playing mountain man. This is my life. I know the rhythm of the seasons. I know when the snow is going to turn mean, and I know exactly how much cured venison it takes to get me through till April. But '98 was different. It started early, freezing solid before Thanksgiving, and by Christmas, the temperature hadn't climbed above zero for 3 weeks straight. We were talking 40 below at night, sometimes 50. The snow piled up so high the roof of my woodshed was level with the top of the drift. I was officially cut off. My old Ford pickup? Forget about it. The nearest town, Darby, was 20 miles of unplowed, frozen hell away. Now, I always prepare. I had enough wood stacked to heat a small army, or so I thought. But when the cold sinks in that deep, you're burning wood just to keep the cabin from turning into an ice cube. I was feeding that stove like it was a hungry monster, day and night. The real problem, though, wasn't the wood. It was the meat. I'd had a terrible hunting season. I'd only taken a small mule deer and a couple of grouse, nothing like the elk I usually relied on. I was rationing hard, but by mid-January, my smoked meat rack was looking awfully sparse. Every time I looked at those dwindling supplies, a knot would tighten in my stomach. Survival out here is simple math. If the input is less than the output, you die, and my math was getting shaky. I was living in a world of white and gray, the silence so heavy it pressed on your eardrums. The only sounds were the wind howling through the chimney and the constant crackle of the fire, my only friend. You get lonely. Out there, sure, but mostly you get hyper-focused. Every chore becomes life or death. Empty the ash bucket, gotta do it fast, or the heat escapes. Chop more wood, gotta stay sharp. One slip of the axe in this cold, and you could lose a finger before you feel the pain. It was during one of these wood-chopping runs that I saw him. It was late afternoon, the weak winter sun already dipping behind the peaks, turning the snow a pale, bruised purple. I was hacking at the backup woodpile, the one I hoped I wouldn't need until March. My breath was freezing instantly on my beard, making it stiff as wire. I stopped to lean on the axe handle, listening to the silence. That's when I noticed the shadow near the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 yards out. It was too big for a coyote, too low to the ground for a deer. It moved with a loping, dragging gait, and even from that distance I could tell it was struggling. A wolf, a big gray male. Now, wolves aren't uncommon up here, but they are smart. They avoid human settlements like the plague, especially when a human is armed and the air smells of wood smoke and civilization. But this one was right there, in the open, not hiding behind the scrub pines. My hand instinctively went to the .30-30 Winchester I always kept leaning against the cabin wall when I was outside. It was loaded, safety off, standard procedure. A wolf this close, this desperate, is a threat to everything I had left. It could tear into my dried meat, or worse, come after me if it was starving enough. I lifted the rifle, sighted down the barrel, and let out a puff of air that instantly turned to ice fog. I had a clear shot at the shoulder, but something held me back. I lowered the rifle just a fraction. I squinted, trying to make him out better in the fading light. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the ground, nose down, occasionally lifting his head to let out a weak, guttural cough. And then I saw the blood. It wasn't a lot, but there were drops of dark red staining the pristine snow behind him. He stopped, finally, and collapsed in a heap, his massive chest heaving. He wasn't resting. He was giving up. I stood there for a long minute, the rifle heavy in my hands. The old instinct, the one that says, "Predator equals threat, eliminate," was screaming in my head. But the other voice, the quiet one that you only hear when you've been alone for too long, started talking too. It said, "He's just as cold as you are, Jed. He's just as hungry." He was magnificent, even in his distress. His coat was thick and gray, dusted with snow, and he must have weighed 150 pounds, maybe more. He was clearly the alpha type, built like a battering ram. But he was broken. I lowered the rifle completely, resting the butt on the snow. "Well, I'll be," I muttered, the words barely audible over the wind. I watched him for another 10 minutes. He didn't move. He didn't even twitch an ear when I started chopping wood again. Carefully, deliberately. He was too far gone to care. Finally, I made a decision that, looking back, was probably the stupidest, most dangerous thing I did that entire winter. But I couldn't leave him to freeze right there on my doorstep. It felt wrong. It felt like bad luck. I went inside, stoked the fire, and grabbed my medical kit, the old Army surplus one I used for treating cuts and sprains. I also grabbed the biggest knife I owned, just in case, and a chunk of the precious venison, a piece I had planned on eating myself 2 days later. When I stepped back out, the air had dropped another 5 degrees. The light was almost gone. I moved slowly, talking in a low, steady voice, the kind of tone you use with a nervous horse. "Easy there, boy. Just me. I ain't gonna hurt ya." He didn't acknowledge me until I was maybe 10 feet away. Then his head snapped up. His eyes, dark, amber, and sharp, focused right on me. There was no fear in them, just pain and a deep, raw exhaustion. He tried to get up, a deep snarl rattling in his chest, but his back legs wouldn't. Cooperate. "Stay down," I commanded, stopping. I tossed the chunk of venison, aiming for the snow just in front of his nose. It hit the ground. The wolf didn't move. He just stared at me. He was beyond the point of caring about food. He was focused on the immediate threat. Me. I took a breath and knelt down, which is a terrible idea around a large, wounded predator, but I needed to see the injury. "Look, I'm just looking," I said, holding my hands out wide and empty, except for the knife, which I kept sheathed and ready. It was worse than I thought. He had a deep gash, high up on his flank, right near the hip. It looked like he'd been kicked by an elk or maybe tangled with a rival pack member and lost badly. The wound was frozen shut on the outside, but underneath, it was clearly infected. He was running a fever, I could tell by the way he was breathing, shallow and fast. I pulled out a pair of thick leather gloves and the bottle of strong antiseptic I carried. The smell of the antiseptic must have hit him, because he let out a sharp, warning snap. "You're going to hate this," I warned him. I worked fast, scrubbing the area with the antiseptic and cutting away some of the matted fur. He fought me, thrashing and snapping, but the cold and the injury had robbed him of his true strength. Twice his teeth grazed my gloves, and I felt the crunch of bone against leather. If he'd had his full strength, I'd have been gutted. When I finished, I smeared a heavy dose of antibiotic salve on the wound and wrapped it tight with gauze and a piece of clean cloth I tore from an old shirt. It wasn't professional surgery, but it was enough to keep the worst of the dirt out and apply pressure. I backed away slowly, getting back to my feet. I picked up the venison and tossed it closer, right next to his nose. "There. You rest up," I told him, "and when you can walk, you get out of here. You hear me? Go back to your own kind." I retreated to the cabin, shaking slightly, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline. I barred the heavy plank door and went straight to the stove, pouring myself a scalding cup of coffee, my hands still smelling faintly of wolf and blood. I looked out the window. The cabin lights threw a small, yellow square onto the snow. The wolf was still there. He had finally lowered his head, and I watched as he slowly, cautiously, took a bite of the raw venison. He ate it in small, exhausted mouthfuls. I expected him to finish the meat and then once he had a little strength back to limp off into the woods. That's what wild animals do. They take what they can get and they vanish. They don't linger. I stayed awake late that night listening. I heard the wind, the cracking of the logs in the stove, and the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the extreme cold. But I never heard the soft thud of a large animal moving off into the deep snow. When the first weak light of dawn crept across the window pane, I peered out. The temperature had dropped to nearly 50 below zero. It was a killer morning. And there he was. He was curled up, nose tucked under his tail, right outside the pale, yellow circle of light from the window, maybe 15 feet from the cabin door. The snow had piled up slightly around his motionless form. He wasn't gone. He hadn't left. I watched him breathe for a long time, the little puffs of vapor escaping his muzzle. He was sleeping, trusting that the human who had just patched him up wouldn't shoot him in his sleep. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. This wasn't just a wounded animal seeking shelter. This was something else. Wolves don't do this. They don't camp out next to men. I tapped lightly on the glass. The wolf's head came up instantly. Those amber eyes locked onto mine. He didn't growl. He didn't snarl. He just watched me with an unnerving intensity, like he was waiting for me to make the next move. I opened the door just enough to slide out a small bowl of water. The water would freeze instantly, but he could lick the ice before it solidified entirely. "I'm not keeping you. You hear me?" I whispered, pulling the door shut quickly. "You're a wild thing. You need to leave." The wolf watched the bowl. He didn't approach it immediately. He just watched the door, watched me, and then, finally, he dragged himself over and lapped at the water. This went on for 3 days. 3 days of me rationing out small scraps of meat and water. 3 days of me watching him through the thick, frosty window. He recovered enough to stand on all 4 legs, though he still favored the wounded flank. He would stretch, look at the forest, and then look back at the cabin. He never tried to get in, never barked, never showed aggression. He just stayed put, claiming the small patch of frozen ground near my door as his sick bay. The cold was relentless. It seemed to intensify the isolation, making everything feel brittle and dangerous. I knew I couldn't afford to feed a wolf, especially with my own supplies running low. Every bite I gave him was a bite I wouldn't have in March. On the 4th morning, I decided I had to force the issue. I couldn't have a massive predator camping out, burning up my resources and attracting unwanted attention from other animals. I stepped out, fully bundled, carrying the rifle again. The wolf rose slowly to meet me. He stood, tall, shoulders squared, his gaze level with mine. He looked strong now, much stronger than the day I found him. "All right, that's enough," I said, keeping my voice low and firm. "You're healed up enough. Go on, get out of here." I raised the rifle just enough to make my point, aiming it slightly above his head. He didn't flinch, he didn't run. Instead, he did something utterly bizarre, something that defied every piece of natural history I knew. He took 2 slow steps toward me, lowered his head submissively, and gave a small, almost imperceptible flick of his tail. It wasn't a happy wag, it was a sign of acknowledgement, a silent communication. Then he turned his powerful body and looked toward the dense woods, the direction he was supposed to go. He paused, looked back at me one last time, and then settled back down onto the snow, exactly where he had been for the last 3 nights. He was refusing to leave. He was choosing the brutal, life-threatening environment of my immediate perimeter over the wild freedom of the forest. And, for the life of me, standing there with the rifle in my hand, I couldn't pull the trigger. I couldn't even bring myself to shout at him. I lowered the rifle, feeling a strange mix of frustration and grudging respect. "Fine," I sighed, the word hanging like a cloud of steam. "Fine. You want to stay? You stay. But you're on your own, buddy. I'm not running a charity." I turned and went back inside, slamming the door shut. I knew, right then, that the winter of '98 had just gotten a whole lot stranger. I wasn't just fighting the cold anymore. I was fighting the logic of the wild, and I was doing it with a huge, stubborn gray wolf standing guard on my porch. And I had a terrible feeling that he wasn't just looking for a handout. He was looking for a partner. I slammed that door, feeling like an idiot. I just had a standoff with a wolf, and the wolf won. He didn't win with teeth or claws. He won with sheer, ridiculous stubbornness. "You're on your own," I told him. But that was a lie, and we both knew it. I was still throwing him scraps. If I didn't, he'd die, and then I'd have a frozen 150-pound corpse on my doorstep until May, attracting every scavenger for 5 miles. So the coexistence began, not out of friendship, but out of grim logistics. The first week of him staying was the strangest period of my life. I started developing a routine around his presence. When I went out to chop wood, which was constantly, I'd keep the 30-30 leaned right next to the cutting block, but I never touched it. The wolf would rise when I came out, stretch, and then settle down again maybe 20 feet away, always watching. He didn't interrupt my work. He didn't beg. He just existed, a massive, quiet anchor in the blinding white landscape. I never named him. Giving him a name felt like admitting ownership, and he was the furthest thing from owned. He was pure wild, but in my head, I started calling him the Big Gray. The silence which had been pressing on me suddenly shifted. Before, the silence was empty, threatening. Now, it was watchful. I wasn't alone anymore. Every time I looked out the window, those amber eyes would meet mine, brief and intense. It was like living next to a ticking time bomb that had decided, for the moment, not to go off. But the cost was immediate and brutal. My meager food supply was vanishing faster than the morning steam from my coffee cup. I was down to 3 pounds of smoked jerky and a handful of dried beans. That was maybe 5 days of rations for me. I was feeding the Big Gray about half a pound of meat a day, just enough to keep him from starving, but not enough to let him thrive. I was literally eating my own future, one small frozen bite at a time. I remember standing in front of the empty meat rack one morning, the cold air in the cabin making my breath plume even indoors. The knot in my stomach wasn't just tightening. It felt like it had been pulled into a hard, painful lump. I was facing starvation, pure and simple. I had to hunt. The problem was the weather. The temperature had settled into a consistent, mind-numbing deep freeze. Anything below 30 below changes the game entirely. Your skin freezes in minutes. If you sweat, that moisture turns to ice inside your clothes, chilling you to the bone. The snow was now packed into an unforgiving, wind-sculpted crust that was almost waist-deep in the woods. Tracking an animal, much less carrying it, back 20 miles, was suicide. I was trapped between the certainty of starvation in the cabin and the high probability of freezing to death outside. It was on the 10th day of the Big Gray's residency that I realized his presence wasn't just a drain. It was a beacon. I was woken up around midnight by a commotion. It wasn't the wind. It was a high-pitched, frantic yipping sound, mixed with a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the cabin floor. I grabbed the lantern and the rifle and peered out the small window above my workbench. The moon was out, a cold, hard disk throwing blue light across the clearing. The Big Gray was standing, his hackles raised, a terrifying silhouette against the snow. He wasn't barking. The noise was pure, concentrated threat. Lined up, maybe 30 yards away, were 6 coyotes. They were skeletal, driven mad by hunger, and they had clearly smelled the small cache of meat I'd left out for the wolf that evening. They weren't afraid of the cabin, they were focused on the food. Coyotes are smart and usually cowardly, but starvation makes them bold. A pack of 6 could easily overwhelm a lone, slightly injured wolf. I watched, holding my breath. I wanted to shoot the coyotes, but the Big Gray was right in the line of fire. The coyotes rushed him, an ugly, desperate wave. The Big Gray moved like lightning. He didn't try to fight all 6. He went straight for the throat of the leader. There was a terrible wet crunch and the coyote went down, thrashing. The wolf was a blur of muscle and fury. His size was his advantage. He was twice the weight of any of them. The other coyotes hesitated, realizing they had stumbled onto a fight they couldn't win. The big gray let out a deep, rattling roar, a sound I'd never heard from a wolf before. Sound of absolute dominance, and the remaining coyotes broke and scattered, melting into the woods. The big gray stood over his kill for a moment, chest heaving, and then, slowly, he turned his head. He looked straight at the cabin window, right at me. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't challenging. It was a look of pure, functional exchange. I defended the perimeter. Now, I eat. He dragged the dead coyote into the deeper shadows and began to feed. I lowered the rifle, my hands shaking a little. He hadn't just defended himself, he had defended the area, and by extension, he had defended me. If those coyotes had gotten bold enough to try and rush the cabin, I would have had a much bigger problem on my hands. When the sun came up, the big gray was back in his spot, curled up, satisfied. The only evidence of the night's violence was a few tracks and a patch of disturbed snow. I realized something profound that morning. The wolf wasn't just taking my resources, he was providing an invaluable service. In this extreme cold, every desperate, hungry thing in the forest was being driven toward the smell of wood smoke and potential food. Having a massive alpha wolf posted on the doorstep was better than any alarm system. But the protection didn't put meat on my table. The next day, I ate my last piece of venison jerky. The day after that, I boiled the last of the beans, scraping the pot clean. I was running on fumes. The stove was roaring, the cabin was warm, but the fuel inside me was gone. I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to go for an elk. I spent the afternoon preparing. I packed my heaviest wool layers, strapped on the snowshoes, the old wooden ones better for deep snow than the aluminum kind, and checked the rifle action until it was smooth as butter. I knew I had maybe 6 hours of functional time outside before the cold would start causing permanent damage. If I didn't find something, I wouldn't just be hungry, I'd be dead. I looked out the window at the big gray. He was resting, but his ears were twitching, sensing the change in my activity. "This is it, pal," I muttered. "You want to stick around. You better hope I come back with something." Just before dawn, I stepped out. The air was so cold it felt like static electricity crackling around me. It was 52 below zero, the worst morning yet. I slung the rifle over my shoulder and clipped into the snowshoes. The plan was simple. Head toward the high meadows where the elk usually wintered, hoping to find a slow, old bull separated from the herd. I took maybe 20 steps into the deep snow, crunching through the frozen crust, and immediately knew I was in trouble. The snowshoes helped, but every step was a Herculean effort. The cold was already biting through my gloves. My lungs felt like they were shrinking. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning on my trekking pole, cursing the brutal conditions. That's when I heard the soft crunch behind me. I turned slowly. The big gray was right there, maybe 5 feet away. He had risen from his resting spot and was standing perfectly still, watching me. "Go home," I hissed, waving my hand, weakly. "Stay at the fire. There's nothing for you out here." He ignored me. He took a few more steps, passing me, and then stopped. He looked back, his amber eyes seeming to ask, "Well, are we going or not?" I felt a surge of familiar frustration. I said, "Get!" I even took a step toward him, trying to be intimidating. He didn't budge. He just stood there, his massive tail held low, but his posture was alert, focused. Then he did the most incredible thing. He took off, moving forward into the deep, unbroken snow, not beside me, but directly in front of me. He wasn't trying to run away. He was breaking trail. The snow was too deep and soft for me to move quickly, but for him, using his powerful shoulders and chest, he plunged through the drifts, packing the snow down with his body weight. He was creating a narrow, semi-firm path. I watched him go maybe 20 yards, then stop, looking back impatiently. Suddenly, the simple math of survival flipped on its head. Walking in fresh, deep snow is exhausting. Walking on a freshly packed trail, even a narrow one, is maybe half the effort. I hesitated for only a second. My pride battled with my survival instinct. Pride is a luxury I couldn't afford at 50 below zero. I stepped onto the trail he had broken. It was still tough going, but infinitely better than before. I could maintain a decent, steady pace. The big gray and I were hunting together. The absurdity of it hit me hard. Jed Stone, the solitary mountain man, was now being led into the wilderness by a wolf he had refused to shoot. We moved like that for nearly an hour. The big gray would break trail for 50 yards, stop, wait for me to catch up, then move on. He didn't rush me, but he kept the pace steady. The cold was still trying to kill me, but now I had a moving shield, a scout, and a pathfinder. The real advantage, of course, wasn't the trail breaking, it was his nose. My human senses were dulled by the cold and the necessity of focusing on movement. The wolf's senses were razor sharp. We reached a small frozen creek bed, winding through a stand of lodgepole pine. The wind here was fierce, scouring the snow clean. The big gray stopped abruptly, lifting his head. His ears swiveled and his nose twitched, taking in the air. He stood frozen, a statue of concentration. Then he dropped his head and started moving very slowly, low to the ground, off the trail he had created, toward a thick cluster of pines maybe 100 yards upstream. He wasn't moving like a trailbreaker anymore, he was moving like a hunter. I stopped instantly, dropping to one knee, the cold seeping through my trousers. I unslung the 30-30, chambering around, silently. I strained my eyes and ears, trying to detect what he had found. Nothing, just the wind and the silence. The wolf reached the pine thicket, then paused, looking back at me. It was a clear signal. Get ready. He didn't rush in. He used the wind perfectly, circling wide and coming in from downwind. I saw him disappear into the shadows. A second later, the quiet exploded. There was a crash of underbrush, the high-pitched snort of a large animal, and then I saw it. A young spike elk, maybe 300 pounds, exploding out of the pines and running straight toward the open creek bed. It was panicked, driven directly into my sightline. The big gray had not attacked it. He had simply flushed it, using his presence and the element of surprise. He was driving the prey to the shooter. The elk was running broadside, maybe 50 yards out. A perfect, clean shot. I inhaled the icy air, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against my shoulder with a deafening crack that seemed to shatter the frozen silence. The elk stumbled, its legs buckling, and it went down hard in the deep snow. It thrashed once, then went still. I stayed on my knee for a moment, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the Arctic air, my heart pounding like a drum. It was done. We had meat. Survival was secured for another month, maybe 2. I got up, my joints protesting the cold, and started the difficult slog toward the downed elk. When I got there, the big gray was already beside the carcass. He wasn't feeding. He was standing guard, his eyes fixed on me. This was the moment of truth. We had hunted together, but now we were back to the core conflict. Resources. I had the rifle and the knife. He had the hunger and the strength. I approached slowly, talking to him in that low, steady voice. "Okay, boy, you earned this. You go first." I pulled out my hunting knife and quickly dressed the elk, working fast before the meat could freeze solid. It was gruesome work, but necessary. The steam rising from the carcass was the smell of life, the smell of victory over the cold. I pushed aside the thick hide and sliced off a massive chunk of warm, red liver, the best part, the prize. I dropped it in the snow right next to the wolf. The big gray, didn't hesitate this time. He took the liver, pulling it into the shadows a few feet away, and began to devour it. It was a raw, visceral display of hunger being satisfied. While he ate, I butchered the rest of the elk, separating the meat into manageable quarters. I knew I couldn't carry it all. I'd have to cache the rest and come back later, maybe tomorrow if the weather held. I strapped the 2 heaviest quarters onto my pack frame. This was going to be a brutal walk back, even with the packed trail. When the big gray finished his meal, he returned. He looked at the remaining meat, then looked at me, then looked at the path home. He understood. The work wasn't done. I started the long, heavy haul back to the cabin. The wolf didn't break trail this time. The weight of the meat forced me to move slower. Instead, he walked beside me, his pace matching mine exactly. He was no longer just leading. He was escorting. The sun was dropping fast when we finally made it back to the clearing. I was drenched in sweat under my layers, which was a dangerous situation, and the cold was biting through my exhaustion. I dropped the elk quarters near the woodshed, collapsing onto the snow, gasping for air. I was alive. I had food. The big gray didn't even look at the meat. He trotted straight over to his usual resting spot near the cabin door, curled up, and put his head down. I managed to drag myself inside, stoking the fire until it roared, shaking off the ice and snow. The moment I was warm enough to think straight, I poured a cup of coffee and went to the window. The big gray was still there. He was watching me. I realized, looking at his massive gray form guarding my door, that I hadn't just saved his life a few days ago. By forcing him to stay, I had inadvertently saved my own. The big gray wasn't a liability. He was the key to surviving this winter. He had done the impossible. He had made the deadly act of hunting possible. But the partnership was only half-formed. We had shared a kill, but we hadn't shared a home. That night, as the temperature plummeted again, I sat by the stove, watching the wolf outside. He was curled tight, but I could see him shiver occasionally. He was still wounded, still healing, and the cold was relentless. I thought about the coyotes he drove off. I thought about the way he had guided me through the snow. He was my protector, my guide, and my hunting partner. He was earning his keep, and then some. And then I did the second, stupidest, most dangerous thing I did that winter. I got up, grabbed the biggest blanket I owned, a thick, heavy wool Hudson's Bay blanket, and opened the cabin door. The big gray's head snapped up instantly. He watched me with intense curiosity, ready to bolt if I showed aggression. I didn't step outside. I just tossed the heavy blanket out onto the snow, right in front of the door, maybe 3 feet from where he was lying. "It's not enough," I said, my voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. "But it's warmer than the snow. You earned it, partner." I closed the door immediately and stood back, watching through the glass. The big gray didn't move for a long time. He sniffed the blanket suspiciously. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and man. Everything a wolf is taught to fear. Finally, slowly, he nudged the blanket with his nose. He pawed at it, testing it. And then, he did it. He dragged the heavy wool under his body, settled down onto the thick padding, and let out a deep, audible sigh. He looked up at the window one last time. It wasn't gratitude I saw in his eyes, not exactly. It was recognition. A bargain sealed. I went to bed that night feeling the strangest comfort. The cold was still trying to break in, the wind was howling, but I knew that outside, wrapped in my wool blanket, was the biggest, fiercest bodyguard a man could ever ask for. But the true test of our partnership was yet to come. The hunt had solved the short-term problem, but the winter was only halfway through. We had food, but we were still isolated, and the cold was getting worse. I had to go back out for the rest of that elk, and what I found when I got back to the kill site the next day changed everything I thought I knew about the big gray. He had a secret, and that secret was about to put both of our lives in unimaginable danger. I shut that door, leaving the big gray wrapped in my best Hudson's Bay blanket, and I stood there leaning against the wood, listening to the wind try to peel the shingles off the roof. It was the quietest night I'd had in weeks, despite the storm outside. The wolf was settled, and I was safe, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I had a full belly and a plan that didn't involve dying of exposure. But the job wasn't done. The elk was still mostly out there, and I had maybe 36 hours before the sub-zero temperatures and the scavengers ruined the rest of that meat. I got maybe 4 hours of sleep. When I woke up, the cabin was still warm. The fire had banked perfectly, and I felt the familiar heavy weight of the wolf's presence just outside the door. I looked through the window. He was still on the blanket, a huge gray lump in the blue morning light. He lifted his head when he heard me moving inside, and those amber eyes locked on. I ate a quick breakfast of dried cornmeal mush, saving the fresh elk for later, and started packing. I took the sled, a heavy canvas tarp, ropes, and my 2 biggest axes. If I was going to haul 400 pounds of frozen meat back 20 miles, I needed to be prepared to work fast and hard. When I stepped out, the big gray was waiting. He was off the blanket, alert, and moving with a noticeable ease that hadn't been there a few days ago. The antibiotic salve and the rest had done him good. He didn't need any instruction. He just started. Walking, heading back the way we had come the day before. He was still breaking trail, but today he was faster, stronger, and more confident. It was clear. He considered this mission his job. The walk was still brutal. 50 degrees below zero doesn't care how much meat you have, but the trail he'd packed yesterday was still functional. We moved with a grim efficiency. We reached the creek bed where the elk had fallen. The sun was high enough now to throw weak white light across the snow, but the shadows were still long and blue. The elk carcass was exactly where I had left it. No sign of coyotes or ravens. The big gray had clearly kept the perimeter clean overnight, or maybe the smell of the massive alpha wolf was enough to deter any casual scavengers. I dropped the sled in the pack, feeling a surge of relief. Survival secured. Now, just the brutal, frozen labor of quartering and hauling. The big gray moved past the elk, though. He didn't stop to claim his share yet. He walked straight to the thicket of pines where he had flushed the elk yesterday. He stopped there, nose down, sniffing intently. He let out a low, soft whine, a sound I hadn't heard from him before. It wasn't a threat, it was a concern. I watched him for a moment, puzzled. The elk was right here. What was he doing? I walked over to the thicket, keeping my rifle ready, assuming he'd found a mountain lion track or something worse. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked back at me, then nudged his nose toward a dense tangle of fallen logs and snow-covered brush. I knelt down, shoving the snow away with my mittened hand. I saw a small, dark opening in the snow under the logs. A narrow space, almost completely hidden. It was clearly a den. I pulled back more brush, and that's when I saw the tracks. They weren't the huge dinner plate tracks of the big gray. These were smaller, more delicate wolf tracks, and they led straight into the den. I felt the blood drain from my face despite the cold. "Oh, no," I whispered. This wasn't just a sick alpha male looking for a handout. This was a family man. I pulled away a final piece of pine bough and peered into the darkness. 2 small dark shapes shifted inside the den. Pups. Maybe 2 months old, maybe less, tiny and weak, curled together for warmth. And then, deeper in the shadows, I saw her. A female wolf, slightly smaller than the big gray but still large. She was thin, painfully thin, and her breathing was shallow. She lifted her head, and her eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, were burning with a fierce, panicked desperation. The big gray had been injured defending his mate, or maybe defending a kill he needed for his family. He hadn't been able to provide, and he couldn't leave them exposed. He had come to the nearest reliable source of protection and food: me. He wasn't just refusing to leave, he was bringing his entire family to my doorstep, slowly, piece by piece. He stood beside me, rumbling a low, steady sound in his chest, a sound meant to reassure the female. I looked at the tiny, shivering pups, then at the starving, wounded female, and then at the big gray, who was now my hunting partner and trail breaker. My 5 days of rations had just become 5 hours. "You absolute son of a gun," I muttered, shaking my head. "You played me." But the anger was thin, quickly replaced by a wave of cold dread. I knew what this meant. It wasn't just a resource drain, it was a massive vulnerability. Weak animals, especially pups, are magnets for trouble. I looked back at the elk carcass. That meat wasn't just for me anymore, it was for 5 lives. I started butchering the elk with frantic speed. I had to get the meat dressed and cached immediately. As I worked, I kept an eye on the big gray. He would pace between me and the den, his body language clear. "Hurry, we are exposed." I managed to get 1/4 of meat wrapped up and on the sled when the big gray let out a different sound. Not a whine, not a growl, but a sharp, high-pitched woof of warning. He wasn't looking at the den. He was looking up the creek bed toward the high country. I froze, knife in hand, the steam from the fresh meat rising around me. I listened. At first, I heard nothing but the wind. Then I heard it, a sound that cuts through the wilderness silence like a serrated edge. The deep, powerful howl of a rival pack. They were close, too close. The big gray's entire demeanor changed. He went from a cautious escort to a coiled spring. His fur bristled, his ears flattened, and he let out a guttural challenge that seemed to shake the cold air. The answering howl was closer this time, and it was multiple voices, a chorus of challenge. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the 30-30. "Damn it, Jed, you knew this was coming," I hissed at myself. The rival pack had likely smelled the fresh kill from miles away, and they would certainly smell the vulnerable female and the pups. They weren't just after the elk. They were after the territory and the elimination of a rival alpha. 6 dark shapes emerged from the pines, moving fast and low to the ground. They were larger than coyotes, lean and black, their coats dark against the snow. There were 4 of them, and they looked healthy, driven by the desperation of the deep winter. The big gray was outnumbered and still wounded. "Stay down," I yelled at the female, though she couldn't understand me. The big gray met the threat head-on. He didn't wait for them to close the distance to the pups. He charged, a blur of gray fury, and slammed into the lead black wolf with the force of a battering ram. The fight was instant and brutal. Teeth snapped, fur flew, and the air was filled with terrible, high-pitched snarls. The big gray was powerful, but the other 3 immediately circled him. One went for his injured flank. He twisted away, letting out a sharp cry of pain. I knew I couldn't stand here and watch him die. If he went down, the black wolves would tear into the den and then come for me. I raised the rifle. I had to shoot, but I couldn't risk hitting the big gray. I aimed high toward the frozen branches above the fighting wolves and fired 2 quick shots. Crack! Crack! The sound was shattering. It echoed off the frozen canyon walls. The black wolves flinched, startled by the sudden, deafening noise. It bought the big gray a split second. He used it, lunging and snapping the neck of one of the black wolves, which dropped instantly. Now it was 3 against 1. The remaining black wolves, though momentarily confused by the human sound, were too hungry to retreat completely. They focused their attack, driving the big gray back toward the den. I had to move. I wasn't going to win this with warning shots. I rushed forward, yelling at the top of my lungs, waving the heavy canvas tarp like a flag. I might not be as fast as a wolf, but I was bigger, louder, and I had the power of irrational human rage on my side. I charged the remaining wolves, swinging the tarp and screaming. The two remaining black wolves were caught in a terrible dilemma: the injured alpha wolf, the scent of the pups, the fresh elk, meat, and now this giant, yelling, weapon-waving human. They hesitated. That was enough. The big gray, seeing my charge, rallied, lunging forward with renewed ferocity. He drove the two black wolves off the carcass and into the pines. They didn't stop to fight again. They vanished into the woods, leaving their dead packmate behind. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged, painful breathing of the big gray. I stood there, panting, the adrenaline shaking my whole body. I looked at the wolf. He was covered in blood, but it wasn't all his. He turned and limped slowly back to the den. He nudged the entrance with his nose. The female whimpered softly inside. The look he gave me then was different from any look before. It wasn't recognition or a bargain. It was trust. Raw, absolute trust. I walked over to the dead black wolf. I knew I couldn't leave it. It would attract more trouble. I quickly field-dressed it and dragged it a quarter-mile away, deep into the woods, leaving it for the smaller scavengers. I couldn't waste the meat, but I couldn't bring a rival wolf carcass back to the cabin. When I returned, I didn't waste another second. I knew the black wolves would be back. I had to move the entire operation. I started quickly cutting the remaining elk meat into smaller, more manageable frozen chunks, wrapping them tightly in the canvas tarp. I loaded the sled until it was piled high with hundreds of pounds of frozen protein. Then came the hard part. I knelt by the den. The female was watching me, her eyes wide. "Look, lady," I said softly, talking to her like she was a person. "We can't stay here. You're too exposed. It's too cold. We're going to my place. It's warm. You and the pups. You have to trust me." I reached slowly, carefully into the den. The female snapped once, a warning, but it lacked conviction. She was too weak. The big gray was standing right beside me, watching. If I made a wrong move, he would kill me. I pulled out the first pup. It was tiny, shivering violently, its eyes barely open. I wrapped it immediately in my scarf and tucked it inside my coat, against my chest. The warmth of my body was critical. The female whined desperately. The big gray nudged her head gently, then looked at me, a silent command. "Hurry." I repeated the process, pulling the second pup and tucking it into my other armpit. They were frail, barely alive. Finally, I focused on the female. She couldn't walk far. I unwrapped the heavy canvas tarp I had brought for the meat, and using the ropes, I fashioned a makeshift sling. I looked at the big gray. "Help me," I commanded. He understood. He walked over to his mate, nudged her until she stood, and then I carefully helped her onto the canvas sling. She was heavy, but I managed to hoist her onto the sled, right on top of the elk meat. It was an impossible load. Hundreds of pounds of meat, a wounded wolf, and 2 pups tucked into my coat. I clipped back into the snowshoes and grabbed the sled rope. "Let's go home," I said, pulling hard. The sled dug deep into the snow, even on the packed trail. It was agonizingly slow. Every step was a battle against the friction and the weight. I was sweating again, a dangerous situation in this cold, but I couldn't stop. The black wolves were out there, and they knew where the den was. The big gray took his place immediately, not breaking trail but walking directly behind the sled. He was the rear guard, the protector of the precious cargo. The trip back felt like a lifetime. The sun started to dip, and the temperature dropped like a stone. I was stumbling, my legs burning, the rifle heavy on my shoulder. When we finally burst through the last line of pines and into the cabin clearing, I collapsed, letting the sled rope slip from my numb hands. I lay there for a minute, tasting the bitter cold air, too exhausted to move. The big gray nudged my shoulder lightly, a soft, insistent pressure. Up. Finish the job. I forced myself up. First things first, the pups. I rushed into, the cabin, pulled the pups out from under my coat, and laid them gently on the wool rug in front of the roaring stove. They were still shivering, but they were breathing steadily. I ran back out. The big gray was already attending to his mate, licking her face gently, urging her off the sled. Getting the female wolf into the cabin was a whole new level of ridiculousness. I had to half drag, half carry her through the narrow doorway. Once inside, she collapsed immediately onto the floor near the fire but far enough away from the pups to give them space. She was exhausted, but her eyes never left them. The big gray followed her in. My tiny 10 by 12 foot cabin, which had been my fortress of solitude for 20 years, was now a maternity ward and a wolf den. I stood there looking at the scene. 2 pups, frail and blind, whimpering softly. A massive, wounded female wolf. And the big, gray, the alpha, standing guard, taking up nearly a quarter of my usable floor space. He turned his head slowly and looked at me. He was standing on my hearth, in my house, looking at me like I was the intruder. I threw my hands up in exasperation. "Fine, you win, all of you. But you follow my rules, you hear me? No chewing the furniture, no fighting over the coffee pot." I knew the rules were meaningless, but I had to say them. I spent the next 2 hours hauling the frozen elk meat inside, stacking it in a corner of the cabin where it would stay frozen but wouldn't interfere with the fire. The smell of raw meat and wet wolf quickly replaced the smell of wood smoke and coffee. The big gray and I had established a partnership in the field, but now the challenge was intimacy. We were shoulder to shoulder in a small box, relying on each other for every breath. For the next week, the cabin was a study in tense, exhausted coexistence. I learned the big gray's name, or rather, the sound he answered to. It wasn't the big gray. When he was talking to his mate, he used a low, resonant huff that was almost a word. I started using it too when I needed his attention. The female wolf, whom I started calling the Shadow because she was so quiet and wary, slowly began to recover. I fed her the nutrient-rich marrow and fat from the elk, and she started showing signs of life. The pups, meanwhile, were tiny, hungry sponges. They needed round-the-clock nursing, which meant the Shadow needed constant food. My food supplies were gone, but the elk was huge. We would make it through February, maybe even March if we rationed wisely. The big gray became my shadow. When I chopped wood, he sat 10 feet away, watching the perimeter. When I went to the well for water, he walked beside me, his massive presence announcing to the forest that this human was untouchable. The true threat wasn't the cold anymore. It was the constant, low-level anxiety of having 4 wild predators living in my space. Every time I reached for the axe or moved quickly, the big gray would tense, watching my hands. Every time he shifted in his sleep, I woke up, rifle within reach. We were surviving, but the psychological cost was immense. One afternoon, about a week after the move, I was sitting by the stove, carving a small wooden figurine, a habit I picked up when the loneliness got too much. The pups were whimpering softly, rooting around their mother. The Shadow was licking them, and the big gray was asleep on his blanket, his head resting on his paws. I reached out slowly and pushed a small piece of wood scrap toward the fire. Suddenly, one of the pups, bolder than its sibling, stumbled away from its mother. It was blind, confused, and it started crawling right toward my boots. My heart seized up. I froze. The Shadow watched, tensing, ready to intervene. The big gray lifted his head instantly, his amber eyes fixed on the pup, then on me. The pup bumped right into my boot, confused by the texture. It let out a tiny, high-pitched squeak of distress. I knew any sudden movement would be seen as a threat. The alpha wolf was ready to defend his child. I took a deep, slow breath. I lowered my hand, palm up, and waited. The pup sniffed my wool sock, then started to nibble lightly, mistaking it for its mother. I didn't move a muscle. I just let it happen. A long, tense minute passed. Then, the big gray did something astonishing. He let out a soft, low, commanding huff. The pup stopped nibbling, turned around, and clumsily crawled back toward the warmth of its mother and sibling. The big gray lowered his head back onto his paws. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't moved. He had simply recalled his pup, communicating to me, without a sound or a growl, that the situation was under control. It was the final confirmation. We weren't just partners, we were co-parents, co-survivors. He trusted me enough to let his child touch me, and I trusted him enough not to move a muscle. That night, as the cold outside sank to a new low, I realized this arrangement was permanent until spring. I was no longer Jed Stone, the solitary mountain man. I was Jed Stone, the reluctant pack member. But the danger I had brought the wolf family in from, the rival pack, the Black Wolves, hadn't forgotten the fresh kill or the territory. We were safe inside the cabin, but the cabin was sealed. I couldn't go out to check the snares. I couldn't get more wood for the inevitable cold snap. That was still coming. We were burning through my reserves, and soon we would need more than just elk meat. The true, deep winter, the one that crushes the spirit and breaks the will, was still ahead. And when it came, it wouldn't be just the cold we had to worry about. The Black Wolves were out there, waiting. They had lost a pack member, and they would be back for revenge, and for the pups, who were growing stronger every day under my roof. Knew that soon the walls of the cabin wouldn't be enough to protect us. We would have to fight, and when that time came, I hoped my new family would be ready. The walls of the cabin were getting thin, not physically but psychologically. For weeks, the five of us, me, the big gray, the shadow, and the two pups, had lived in a state of hyper-vigilant truce. The pups were growing fast, fat on elk meat and their mother's milk. They were starting to open their eyes, those little amber marbles, and they were clumsy, tumbling around the hearth like little balls of gray fluff. But the wood pile was dwindling. We were hitting the absolute coldest part of the year, late February, what the old-timers called the Iron Month. The temperature outside hadn't been above 20 below for 10 days straight, and I was feeding the stove every 2 hours, day and night. I was down to the last 5 feet of my reserve stack. If I didn't get more, we would all freeze, pups included. I looked outside. The snow was a blinding, pristine white, shimmering under the weak winter sun. It was still 50 below. I knew the Black Wolves were out there. They had tasted blood and defeat. They were waiting for us to make a mistake, waiting for the cold to weaken us further. Moving the whole pack back to the cabin was a masterstroke by the big gray, but it had created a siege situation. "Gotta go, partner," I muttered, strapping on my coat. The big gray was instantly awake. He rose from his blanket, stretched his massive frame, and looked at me, then at the rifle. He understood the mission. Wood. I left the shadow and the pups curled up in front of the fire, the elk meat stacked high in the corner. I grabbed the axe and the 30-30. We stepped out into the crushing cold. The air instantly stole the breath from my lungs. The big gray led the way, not breaking trail this time but walking slightly ahead, his head constantly swiveling, sniffing the sharp air. We were only going 50 yards to the main woodpile, but every step felt like a march across enemy lines. I chopped fast and furiously, not stopping for breath, loading my arms with as much split wood as I could carry. The big gray stood guard, silent and immovable, a statue carved from granite and fir. I made 2 round trips, dragging the heavy wood back to the cabin. On the second trip, I stopped, breathing hard, leaning on the axe. The big gray was staring toward the dense, thick pines on the northern edge of the clearing. He didn't growl, but his tail was stiff, held high. "What is it?" I whispered, lifting the rifle. He let out a low, challenging hoof. The sound I knew meant serious trouble. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just shadows and snow. but I trusted his senses completely. The black wolves were near. They were watching us work. They were waiting for us to be tired, vulnerable, or separated. We rushed back inside, slamming the heavy plank door shut. I barred it with a steel rod, then piled the freshly chopped wood next to the stove. The air inside the cabin immediately felt different. The tension was palpable. The shadow was on her feet, ears twitching low to the ground. She knew they were close too. I poured myself a cup of hot coffee, but my hands were shaking too hard to drink it. I sat on my bunk, the rifle across my knees. The big gray stood squarely between the fire and the door. He wasn't moving. He was waiting. The sun started to drop around 4 in the afternoon. The light outside turned that cold, bruised purple color, and the temperature plummeted again. We were safe. We were warm. We had meat. But we were trapped. The attack came just as the last sliver of light disappeared from the western peaks. It didn't start with a howl. It started with a sound of desperation, a loud, frantic scratching and digging at the back corner of the cabin near the foundation. They weren't trying to come through the door. They were trying to burrow under the log walls where the snow was deepest. The big gray erupted. He let out a terrifying, deep-chested roar, a sound of absolute fury and defense. He lunged at the back wall, scraping his claws against the logs, matching the frantic noise outside. The pups started yelping in terror. The shadow, despite her still healing wounds, positioned herself over them, shielding them with her body. I jumped up, grabbing the lantern and the rifle. I knew exactly where they were digging. There was a small gap between the bottom log and the frozen earth, usually sealed by snow, but the digging had exposed it. "Stay back!" I yelled at the big gray, though he wouldn't listen. I kicked open the small, heavy trapdoor I used for accessing the crawl space beneath the cabin. The smell of cold earth and pine needles rushed up. I held the lantern down low. 2 pairs of eyes, dark and glittering with hunger, were staring back at me from the shallow pit they had dug. They were the 2 remaining black wolves, lean and driven mad by the cold and the fresh scent of the pups. One of them lunged, snapping its jaws, trying to get through the gap. I didn't hesitate. I lowered the rifle barrel and fired. Boom! The sound was deafening inside the small cabin. The smell of gunpowder was instantly thick and choking. The wolf let out a terrible yelp and collapsed. The other wolf, startled by the noise and the sudden death of its partner, scrambled backward out of the hole. I slammed the trapdoor shut and threw my entire body onto it, jamming the heavy hunting knife into the latch for extra security. The cabin was chaos. Smoke was everywhere. The pups were wailing. The shadow was growling low, and the big gray was pacing, his muscles twitching, ready to tear the door off its hinges. "It's okay! It's okay!" I yelled, trying to reassure them and myself. The immediate threat from below was gone, but the surviving black wolf knew we were cornered. The wolf outside started to howl, a chilling, triumphant sound, meant to draw attention. It was trying to lure us out, or maybe just break our nerve. The big gray answered him. He walked to the main door and let loose a howl of his own. It was not a call of distress or loneliness. It was a roar of challenge and territorial dominance, the sound of an alpha protecting his family and his stronghold. It was the deepest, most terrifying sound I had ever heard from an animal. The black wolf outside went silent, clearly intimidated by the sheer power of the sound coming from inside the human structure. Then there was silence. A long, agonizing silence where I could hear nothing but the raging fire and the frantic beating of my own heart. I reloaded the rifle, my hands shaking. I knew he was still out there. We waited. 10 minutes, 20, an hour. Then the second attack came, and this one was smart. It was aimed at the weakest point, the window. The glass was thick, but it was just glass. There was a crash as the wolf slammed its body against the window frame, trying to shatter the pane. The glass didn't break, but the frame shuddered violently. the big gray launched himself across the room. He didn't hit the glass, but he slammed his weight against the wall, directly next to the window, letting out a series of explosive, short barks that were right in the wolf's face. The black wolf, outside, already injured and now terrified by the combination of the gunshot and the massive wolf suddenly appearing right next to him, scrambled away from the window. I rushed over, pulling the heavy wool blanket off my bunk and jamming it between the window frame and the wall, reinforcing the weak point. Then, the big gray did something that sealed our survival. He had established his dominance, and now he had a message to send. He walked back to the front door, let out one final, immense, echoing roar that seemed to shake the snow from the trees, and then he settled down directly in front of the door, his body a massive, furry barrier. The black wolf never came back. We had survived the siege. We had won. I stood there for a long time in the dark, the smell of gunpowder fading, replaced by the smell of wolf and pine. I didn't move the dead wolf outside. I left it there, frozen solid under the cabin, a warning to any other desperate creature. The rest of the Iron Month passed in a blur of constant vigilance, but the threat was gone. The combination of the gunshot and the big gray's ferocity had broken the pack's will. The pups started toddling around, chewing on my boots and investigating the stove. The shadow fully recovered, moving with the quiet grace of a true predator. And the big gray, he was my partner, my shadow, my pack. We had survived the impossible together. And then, one day in late March, I woke up to a different sound. It wasn't the howl of the wind. It was the soft, persistent drip, drip, drip of water running off the roof. Spring. The sun was higher, the shadows were shrinking, and the air smelled wet and earthy, not brittle and frozen. The snow around the cabin was starting to soften. The time was coming. I knew, deep down, that this arrangement couldn't last. They were wild. I was wild, but in a different way. The big gray knew it too. He started spending more time outside, resting on his blanket in the sun, looking toward the high country where the elk herds would soon be moving. One morning, about a week into the thaw, I woke up and the cabin was quiet. Too quiet. I sat up instantly. The shadow was gone. The pups were gone. I looked over at the hearth. The big gray's blanket was empty. My heart sank, but I knew it was right. No goodbye, no ceremony, just the wild claiming its own. I rushed to the door, pulling the bar back, and stepped out into the damp, thawing air. The clearing was empty. The snow was soft, and there were fresh tracks leading away from the cabin, heading north toward the mountains where the spring melt would bring new life and new food. I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing where the path became the dense forest. I stopped there, looking at the place where the big gray's massive tracks, the shadow's smaller prints, and the wobbly, tiny paw prints of the two pups vanished into the woods. I waited for a moment, listening to the silence of the spring morning. I raised my hand and let out the sound I had, learned in the deepest, darkest cold of that brutal winter. "Huffs!" I called out, my voice rough. "Go well, partner." The only answer was the sound of a raven calling high up in a pine tree. I turned back toward the cabin. It felt massive now, empty, and strangely cold despite the rising temperature. I walked back inside, noticing all the small details. The scratch marks on the log wall, the faint, musky scent of wolf, the deep indentation of the big gray's body still pressed into the wool blanket. I spent the next few days cleaning up, airing out the cabin, and starting the long, hard process of thawing out the water pipes and preparing the garden. I was Jed Stone again, the solitary mountain man. But I wasn't the same man. I still keep the 30-30 leaned against the wall, but I haven't needed it for anything but targets since that winter. Sometimes, late in the summer, when the air is warm and the crickets are singing, I'll be out chopping wood, and I'll stop, leaning on the axe handle, and I'll listen. And sometimes, very rarely, carried on the high, clear mountain air, I'll hear a howl. It's not the desperate howl of a starving creature, and it's not the challenging roar of a rival. It's a full, rich, confident sound, and I always answer it. Not with a howl, but with the sound I learned in the darkest winter of my life. I'll cup my hands around my mouth and send it out across the ridges, a soft, low, commanding huff. And I know, deep down in my bones, that somewhere out there, among the high peaks of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, the Big Gray hears me. He knows I'm here, and he knows I survived. We were just two desperate creatures, cut off by the cold, who found out that sometimes the only way to beat the absolute worst of the wild is to forge a partnership that defies every rule of nature. And that, folks, is how I got through the winter of '98. I didn't just survive the cold, I became part of the pack, and I learned that even in the deepest solitude, you're never truly alone if you know how to listen to the silence.